rather remarkable thing happened in the news last week, which is weird that it's getting almost no notice, no discussion. The government released a whole bunch of papers, or as we say in the Navy, a trenchant of papers regarding the Kennedy assassination, 1963, JFK. And you would have thought that these papers would have caused an explosion of discussion, particularly on the interwebs. But oddly enough, that hasn't happened. I think there's some reasons for that, but it's always fascinating to me to see this stuff come out for the Kennedy assassination. Why? I think I've told you this before, but for me, my introduction to talk radio, particularly conservative talk radio, was an interview in 1981 that I heard on KSL 1160 AM in Salt Lake City. As I was a junior and senior in high school, KSL was my radio station. FM was around, but it was mostly classical music and or really hard rock music in those days. AM radio was still what it was, and KSL was the epitome of what an AM radio station should still be in my mind. In the morning, it was news. Midday to late afternoon, it was music. And by music, I mean what they would classify today as oldies. But in those days, it was, what your average 30-year-old Utahn would be listening to. A lot of Peter, Paul, and Mary, a lot of Simon and Garfunkel, Neil Diamond, Bobby Darin, that sort of thing. It was good music. I liked it, and that's what I would listen to. And then round about 4 or 5, they would do an hour and a half of news. That was followed by CBS Radio Mystery Theater, which I still love. And then that was followed by this talk show that would come on, as I recall, around 7. I don't remember how long it lasted, but it was interesting. But the very first one that I actually can consciously remember listening to was this interview with a guy by the name of David Lifton, who had just released a book. This was early 1981. He had just released a book called Best Evidence. Now, the book Best Evidence is, to this day, it's still considered the gold standard of Kennedy assassination conspiracy theories. Of all the Kennedy assassination theories, it's literally the only one I read that I actually doesn't make me want to just start throwing things. At least it's well thought through. It's not just that, well, I heard somewhere that. And it's pretty well researched. It's pretty well backed up. It's still not right, but that's a story for another day. What I remember about that moment was being absolutely enthralled by this interview with David Lifton. And you got to remember, I was 17. I was a senior in high school. I was weeks from joining the Navy. And at that point in my life, I still was developing my mindset about how to think about things. And this was fascinating to me. There was a guy telling me that what I'd heard all my life, what I'd read, because for reasons that go way beyond the scope of this show, when I was 14, I read the Warren Report. You'll injure yourself when you fall asleep and your head hits the desk. At any rate, I was still developing how I thought. And here was something else talking to me about how to think outside the box, how to get into those things. And I look at that moment now, all these years later, 40 years later. Is that right? 81, 91, 01, 40 years later, as kind of a watershed moment. What I wasn't able to coalesce in my mind then, now after 2 decades in the media business, I can see a little bit clearer. I understand what was going on. The reality of it is content is king when it comes to spoken word programming, whether that's talk radio, whether it's podcasting, even television. Content is king. And Lifton's Best Evidence book was good content. There wasn't a lot of challenge to him, as I recall, as there would be now, but it was interesting. It was intriguing. It was one of the first times I ever really remember not wanting to go do something else because I wanted to hear it, wanted to go what's going on. The content is king. The goal is, of course, reach. How many people hear what I'm having to say? And are they the right people? That's the bigger question. It's a process that you take right out of public relations school. There's a concept known as ATTIC, A-T-T, little I, big C. And it stands for the four elements of a PR type programming. The agent, which is, in the case of this show, the agent is me. I'm the person doing the action. The target, which is you, the audience, although maybe not necessarily. I used to tell people this when I was in ministry. There were times when you would find yourself overwhelmed by a situation and you would literally write a sermon for one person, literally write that. You could have a congregation of 1,000 people, but you want to talk to that one guy right now or that one gal. And so you spend all week writing this sermon for him, and then inevitably they don't show up. They don't hear it, which is why I would tell people never do that, because really it's kind of like the old Lincoln thing about writing the letter. You know, when you're really mad, you write that letter that really tears them up and yeah. And then you tear it up and throw it in the fire because it's not going to do any good. Anyway, the agent, the target can be the audience, but it can also be a niche of the audience. Maybe some days when I'm doing this show, I'm talking to the Kennedy assassination people. Maybe some days I'm talking to the Navy people or the submarine people. It's very rare that a show is really aimed at the entirety of the audience, because the audience is large enough that not all of you are going to care about everything that I have to say on every given day. Some people right now, their eyes are glazing over and they're going, why the hell is he talking about this? The tactics that are used, that's the other T. A lot of that has to do in talk radio. A lot of it has to do with personality. There are tactics that can be used that are effective on some audiences and some targets, and not effective on others. You see this in different radio talk show hosts. There are some show hosts that I can name whose entire shtick is yelling at people and hanging up on them. Others that, just like to call people names. Other people that try to be thoughtful and considerate. Some people who try to be funny. I knew a guy once who billed himself as the funniest man in radio. At any rate, it all depends on the personality behind the microphone. And of course, there's a context, time and place. The disadvantage of podcasting over radio is that in radio, it's immediate right now. This afternoon, something happened and I'm on the air talking about it. Podcasting is a little bit different because it's not, it tends to be more evergreen. I don't know if you knew this or not. This is some inside baseball here. Podcasts are measured over the course of a 30-day period, normally. So if I do a podcast today, I won't have its final numbers, how many people actually download and listen to it, for another 30 days. Well, what if it's about what's happening in New York Times right now? Do you care 2 weeks from now? Maybe not. Context has something to do with that. And so it's harder sometimes when you're doing podcasting to try to make it more what we used to call evergreen in radio. That was the hardest part. Every now and then we'd have to do best of shows, right? And the hard part about best of shows is that they had to be relatable to that time frame. If we were running a best of show about something that happened in Modesto 7 months ago, nobody would care. Or if it was a emergency disaster type thing, people would be calling the station and go, what's going on? It's happening again? So you got to be real careful. It's one of the reasons why we did a lot of best ofs as Constitution Thursdays, Top Fives, and Fun with News, because they were evergreen. They didn't matter when you listened to them. They'd still either be funny or educational. So that context becomes important to what you're doing. And when I think about the future of podcasting in general, because this is where I'm at, I think about those things. For the record, I hate what I call processed shows. You know what a processed show is? It's very scripted. So it is a guy reading to you or a girl reading to you a page that they have scripted through, and maybe they put a little inflection into it, but maybe they don't. And then you hear the page turn and on they go. I don't like it when it's overproduced. I like live radio. I will always want my show to feel very live. It's always going to be recorded live, even if it's not broadcast live. It will always be recorded live. So if I screw up and, drop my coffee cup or something, or my cat meows or whatever, you're going to hear it because it's part of what's going on here. Maybe that's annoying. Maybe it's not. I don't know. But to me, it gives it a much more live feel. And I prefer live talk because, like I discovered that night with David Lifton, it makes both the host and the guest better. You have to think on your feet. You never know what question somebody's going to ask you. I mean, I'm well on record as I always hated callers to telephone shows, but you never knew. I mean, sometimes you'd get one that would really spark a conversation. Most of the time, not. I like conversations about things that are interesting, not necessarily, not always, but relevant, but certainly interesting. And it takes me back to those days where I was on the Midwatch, on the submarine, underwater, cruising the Pacific Ocean at 4 knots to nowhere. And some of the conversations that we would get into in the middle of the night that would make you go, well, what about? And they weren't always relevant to what was going on. I mean, nuclear deterrence, what was going on, but they were interesting conversations. I wish we'd have taped them back then. They're interesting conversations, not always necessarily relevant. And this is, the Dave Lifton thing. This was 1981. Kennedy had been assassinated nearly 20 years before. Wasn't necessarily relevant. And even if Lifton was correct, and this was a huge conspiracy and the government was behind it or somebody was behind it, and number one, he couldn't prove who it was. And number two, what if he is right? Is anything really going to change? That's the real battle, isn't it? Lifton's book was, and still is, fascinating. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. It's well written. It's seemingly well researched. But if you are thinking, you will quickly see the holes in the plot and you will go, what about? And then what I like about his book is that you'll go, okay, well, maybe he'll address this a little bit later. And he seems to hint that he will, but then he doesn't. So some things that are in there, no spoiler alerts, but you get the idea. All this became interesting to me because of the release last week of all these documents again that proved that Lee Harvey Oswald met with the Soviets. Well, we already knew that. We already knew that Lee Harvey Oswald met with the Soviets, but now we have proof that he did. We had proof before, but now we have proof again. And what was remarkable to me about this whole thing was that we're once again back to the idea that conspiracy theories are fun, but not very realistic. What do I mean? Some weeks ago, and I think we talked about this, the Navy released the Thresher trenchants. Remember this? We talked about it at the time. There's all this paper that they're declassifying about the Thresher. Well, most of us read that, and there were a few things in there, a few bits in there that didn't really prove anything new, but they reinforced what we already believed. And one of the quotes was in there as the captain of the Thresher who said that he was very much afraid of unisolatable flooding. Well, no duh. Every submariner is. But for some reason, he felt compelled to write that down in his reports about what was going on with Thresher before she went out and was lost. Conspiracy theories are fun. They're not very realistic. Oswald met with the Soviets. We know that. That doesn't prove that he did or didn't shoot Kennedy in any way, shape, or form. Lots of people did in those areas. But it does mean that there's opportunities now for more of that kind of crazy stuff going on. The proliferation of podcasts to the point now where literally Rod and I joke almost every day about who has a podcast and who doesn't have a podcast. And what was it the other day? Something about a chimp that had a podcast. And then there was a discussion about God having a podcast. And sure as shooting, there was a podcast where some guys pretended to be, there was a radio show. Remember this, the Jesus Christ show, where some guy pretended to be Jesus Christ on the radio? It was sad, but who doesn't have a podcast anymore? But with more podcasting means that there's more opportunities for this kind of stuff out there. It makes things fun, but what it also makes it is a reminder to me that still got to be relevant and interesting, and content is still king. Which brings me back around to this David Lifton thing, which I know is where I started, and you're still wondering, what the hell is he talking about? David Lifton's idea was that Kennedy was shot from the front. Now, there's nothing unusual in that theory. There's a lot of people who believe that he was shot from the grassy knoll or from the sniper's nest or whatever. His theory, though, is much more proof of a conspiracy, which is that the autopsy was, by combination, both botched and manipulated. In other words, that the autopsy is not accurate, that the autopsy was modified to support the conclusions of the Warren Commission, which that he was shot from behind. And he has some evidence for this, some evidence. He calls it the best evidence. I call it some evidence. And much of that some evidence can always be challenged elsewhere. We had this happen with Thresher a few weeks ago. We had a well-known submarine site report that one of the trenches in Thresher revealed that one of these searching submarines had heard sonar signals coming from Thresher for as much as a day afterwards. Could possibly men have survived for a day? Now, intelligence told us that wasn't possible. It wasn't realistic. It was a spurious report. It was some evidence. It was not the best evidence. And we had to go through this whole thing where old pains were renewed, old wounds were reopened over a spurious report. And when I think about what Lifton was talking about, 20 years after the assassination, was we're digging this up again. And are we really going to prove anything? I mean, unless you literally have ironclad proof of this, and you can walk into a courtroom, the Supreme Court of the United States, and say, boom, here it is anything going to change? We have in the news today, Rod and I have already been talking about this today, and Bill and I have been talking about this today, the whole thing with the Clinton the Durham investigation. And the comment I made to them was, I realize this is exciting for geeks like us, but for most people, their eyes just glaze over. They don't care. It's being intentionally made so complicated that it's impossible to unravel and to follow. Hell, the Kennedy assassination theories are easier to figure out than this Durham investigation. I mean, it's just, I know many of you listening don't see it that way, but reality is most Americans look at it and go, oh my God, what next? The content there is so confusing and so bad that it's never going to go anywhere. And even if you could go anywhere, what do you think is going to happen? Even if the Republicans do manage to take the House in 2022, and for the record, I'm not sold that they will. I hope that they will. Not sold on it, even if they manage to take the Senate. Again, I'm even less sold on that, although I'm hopeful. The Republicans are putting out memos today that they're going to go after the Biden administration. Well, why don't you worry about taking those two things first and then worry about all that? Because what are you going to do? You're still not going to have 2/3 majority. You're still not going to impeach him. And even if you do impeach him, all you're going to do is put Kamala Harris in the White House, who believes that she can rule everything with a pen. I don't quite comprehend that whole thing, but neither do I trust the Republican Party. I live by the mantra, never underestimate the power of the GOP, the ability of the GOP to completely and utterly screw things up. Let's get past the midterms and then talk about those kinds of things. The bottom line is nothing in this Durham investigation is going to change anything, just like nothing in the Thresher trenchant is going to change anything. Nothing in Best Evidence, David Lifton's book, that really drew me into talk radio, it's going to change anything. You know why? It's really simple. And it's something that I didn't realize back in 1981, but I finally realized now. And the reason that I've realized it is because I've spent all these years learning how to think. And if nothing else in my career in talk radio and in podcasting, this is what I hope I do. I hope I encourage you to think. Thinking is not illegal. It might be someday, and we might have thought criminals, but for the now, taking the time to think about things is actually a good character to have, good character virtue to have. And had I stopped and thought about it back in 1981, I would have realized this back then, but I didn't. It took me a long time to realize this very simple truth, this very simple idea. If these papers that they were releasing on Oswald, the Kennedy assassination, proved anything that was not already the official line via the Warren report, if they had anything in them that in any way, shape, or form implicated anyone other than Lee Harvey Oswald, they would not have been released. Sorry. They'd be like the Thresher documents with redactations, and they wouldn't be out there. And so nothing has changed, except hopefully our thinking about things and our realization that if we take the time to think about things, maybe it's not quite as complicated as we think it is. And the best evidence really is right in front of us if we would just take the time to think about all of these things and face the real politic of the situation, I suppose. Either way, I still believe Lee Harvey Oswald shot Kennedy.